Theresa is the director of the Somatic Psychology Program at JFK. So she's been involved in this work for a very long time. I'm thrilled to have her. And I think the really special part of tonight's program is really looking at the body, not just as a vehicle of the soul, but as an experiential ground for spiritual awakening. So I'm thrilled to have you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Thank you for inviting me and for having me. And welcome to all of you. Welcome to this topic, which is a topic very dear to my heart. Spirituality, a descent into the body. So thank you for coming out on a Thursday evening to join me in this as we're discussing some thoughts and issues connected to this topic. And I thought what I wanted to do to start out with, I wanted to give you a little bit of a context out of which really this topic arose before I dive into some of the more conceptual pieces. As Barbara was saying, I've been in the somatic world for quite a while, several decades. And it's been a place for me. Somatic exploration has been a very important path for me because I feel like it has been the journey that allowed me to tap deeply and directly into my own aliveness. So somatic explorations felt like they're just a necessity for me to get to know and to deepen into who I am. But I've also, as Barbara mentioned, I've also been in the spiritual world for quite some time, and in a way, just even the fact that I call it the somatic world and the spiritual world tells us that we're dealing a little bit with a schism. And the schism is, I mean, we know there's a schism between body and psyche, but there's another schism between body and spirituality. And I felt like I wanted to bring the discussion about body as the avenue for spiritual awakening more to the center, because even in practices that would embrace somatic exploration, they didn't necessarily put it into the forefront of the spiritual journey. So really the question arose out of my own need to want to bring these pieces together. And another piece, I think there's, as we're looking at somatic endeavors, there's a sense that oftentimes we're working towards something that I would call an ideal body, where we're somehow wanting to cultivate a state that brings us into our most natural state, yeah? So we have some sense of what we're after, but we don't necessarily talk about it, what that really means that we're looking for, even just sometimes implicitly. So these were all thoughts that came up that prompted me to move a little further in that direction. And I'm just curious, how many of you here are either in the somatic program or have a somatic practice, meaning that could be yoga, that could be vipassana, just so that I have a sense. So quite a few of you. So you know, diving into your body, you're encountering many different layers. And one thing that I had to recognize, and that I actually had to really own, even though I had been playing in that terrain for a long time, I had to own the fact that there was an old saying still working in me to a certain extent. And maybe some of you know that saying. Have you ever heard of that? Where you're being told you are not your body. Does that make sense? Have any of you? It's actually in different circles. It's sort of being used to help us to not get identified with our body. But I also feel this kind of a stance often has quite some impact. So the question is, how does this kind of perspective impact you? And it sounds like not everybody feels like it's something you know or it's something that you've operated on. But it's a fairly known stance in the world. Let's just put it that way. So the question is, even if it's hidden, what does that do to us? How does that impact our spiritual practice if that's what we're operating from? And then it speaks a little bit about the fact that we have a certain relationship to our body. And I think well, coming back to the somatic field, it's interesting because oftentimes when I talk to people, I get more of a sense of people wanting to pursue a sense of a deepened embodiment, and they're not necessarily people who say very clearly, I feel so embodied. Who can say here, I feel so embodied? For who is that true right now? If so, raise your hand. Great, so we have a few. What I'm trying to get at is that oftentimes that is not the case. People often have a different kind of relationship to their bodies. They, I think, at best have a relationship that is friendly, but maybe not necessarily deep. And so what I've been wanting to explore with this whole topic is, first, where are we coming from as a collective in terms of how we're viewing our body and how we are including it in our spiritual journey. And the way I'm proceeding here, I'm looking first at our collective development, because I feel like I'm a developmentalist at heart. And basically, my sense is that we traverse more or less individually the big stages that the collective through the evolutionary process has sort of carved out for us. That doesn't mean we don't take it further, but there are certain steps that many developmentalists describe that are steps that many have gone through before us. Yeah? So I want to invite you to follow me on this journey just to get a sense of where are we as a collective. And I want to differentiate here. We all may be, because you're all connected to the school, whether you're students here or whether you're staff here or whatever. That means this CIS, like JFK, has a particular orientation. And that means most of the time we recognize, even though sometimes it's mostly cognitively, we recognize the value of including the body. But then the next layer is to really look at, so when I look at my experience, what is it that actually shows up? So that we're learning to be honest with where we are in this process, in this development of embodiment, as I call it, yeah? So I'm sort of pointing very broad strokes and just see if or how that makes sense to you. So I wanted to look at the origin of Western dualism. Now, usually when you look at Western philosophy, you start with Plato, because there's always the saying, all the philosophies after Plato are merely a footnote to Plato's philosophy, because he so much set the course for us in a certain direction. So when we're trying to understand how we are relating to this issue of body and mind and body and soul, it's very useful to look at Plato, who actually set the stage in a certain direction. And what I want to say here, which is not always known, Plato himself was at a quite at a transitional time. He was at a time where two paradigms were sort of fighting or struggling for dominance. There's the paradigm that was the more prevalent and the known paradigm, which was much more of an earth-based orientation. So what we would call the pre-Socratics, they had an earth-based orientation, which means that we humans, we are the children of the earth. It means our bodies are the offspring of nature. And it also means that truth is something that we can sense, not just something that we can think. So having said that, we all know that Plato was also deeply impacted by one of his main teachers, who was Socrates. And through Socrates, he moved into he moved into the Socratic method. And he moved more towards a transcendent worldview. That means there was a lot of emphasis given to the development of logic. There was emphasis given to the dialectic inquiry, to questioning objectively in order to draw out answers. So what happened is, that's where Plato oriented towards. In a way, he left the concrete behind. He moved away from the earlier pre-Socratic primal organismic knowing. His theory of form is like the quintessential model of a move towards the abstract, because it posits that there are forms, perfect forms, beyond the material world. And these forms are eternal and immutable patterns. So the theory created the world of abstract objects that can be known by subjects. So in a way, it started to create the distinction of subject and object. Now just think about it. Coming out of a much more mythic and mythologically oriented paradigm, where everything is connected, to then pull out the self as this observing and thinking entity that is independent from context, independent from time and space, was a huge developmental step. And I actually want to say, in my mind, it was a very important developmental step. But, like every development, at some point, it has to be superseded by something else. But what this did, in terms of the relationship to the body, he began to separate body and psyche. So I'm wanting to almost highlight that, because when you think about it, this was an evolutionary step. That there is the beginning of an autonomous self that can think in a way that separates there is me and my body. Yeah? So this development, in a way, got continued by several Greek philosophers. So the next one that I'm sure all of you are familiar with is Aristotle, who was a student of Plato's. And he didn't quite have the separation, or as clearly, he spoke more of a hierarchy of things, meaning that existence, that the universe presents itself in shades of density, and they're all connected. But and he was a very strong empiricist. He was exploring everything through the senses. But nonetheless, he very much emphasized reason, and therefore supported a transcendent perspective. I'm going to mention one more of those important thinkers, and that is Plotinus, who several centuries later came up with what he called an emanation theory, which again sees the expression of the universe in these shades of density emanating from the gross to the subtle. But what he always was very clear about is that there's an underlying source that is not separable from the expressions. So in a way, there is oneness that is connected to all that arises. So nonetheless, he had a matter-mind hierarchy. He had a hierarchy that privileged the intangible over the tangible. And therefore, he held a subtle, transcendent perspective. Now, I'm just curious, I want to ask you, if it makes sense, why would there be a privileging of the transcendent? What is a quality of the transcendent that is not present in the same way in the immanent? Any thoughts around this? Yeah?
Well, it's more eternal.
Yes, that's exactly it. It's eternal, it's permanent. So there is a sense that anything that's permanent is more valuable. Yes?
It also reflects if the sky, the god is, if the male deity is upward, then transcendent, you get that privilege again.
Yes, yes. So this was basically, this was a very clear, transcendent, and also patriarchal perspective. Yeah? Now, as we all know, but I want to just sort of track it a little bit, that development continued and it got reinforced by different players. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean viewpoints that valued the immanent weren't there, but they were certainly the quieter voices. So, looking at fast forward to the Middle Ages, we're going to see how dualism continued. St. Augustine, early Middle Ages, he essentially Christianized Plato. And he saw man as the one in between God and the world. And it was man's task to contend with the danger of being tarnished by the physical world or the body. So the notion of the sinful flesh, he was somebody who promoted that perspective. And as we know, it really has stayed, I think, not just with Christian concepts, but it has stayed with Western concepts for a long time. quite a bit later, St. Thomas of Aquinas, understood as the one who Christianized Aristotle, again had a slightly less distinct separation between body and soul, because he too saw a continuum of existence, and the body in a way is part of the creation. But at the same time, as did Aristotle, he sought to prove God through rational inquiry. So the senses, again, weren't an important pathway in that journey. Now, we can't talk about Western dualism without talking about René Descartes. And you probably all know Descartes is often considered the father of Western dualism. I think when we're looking at this, it's not quite true, because I think it really started with Plato. But at the same time, what Descartes did, he really promoted a radical division between spirit and matter. And it was him who gave this cognitive sense of I a superior value to the material world. And we all know his saying, I think, therefore I am. Yeah? And I wonder, my sense is that notion is still quite true in terms of how it infiltrated into our psyche. So, what this development did, it was a necessary development that on one hand allowed freedom from traditional worldviews, from traditional constraints. It allowed freedom from the here and now, which, as we all know, laid the ground for objective and scientific inquiry. Because we can't even create a hypothesis of this is happening if our thinking is just bound to the here and now. So in a way, we actually have to credit much of our advances to that kind of development, which allowed us to step out of the conditions that we were in. But the differentiation of subject and object also became a separation of subject and object. So it cemented a dualistic picture in the Western psyche. And with it comes and came the notion that our body is separate and inferior. And reason is that which is to be valued and to be cherished and cultivated. I like Charlotte Spretnak, I believe. She said that dualism is to us like water to fish. And when you begin to explore your languaging, you begin to observe how you speak about things, you recognize how deeply that is embedded in us. How many of you here talk about me and my body? Do you? That's how we language it. What is that? That's a dualistic viewpoint. There is me, which represents a sense of self, and there's my body, which is this separate kind of entity. So our language itself already tells us how it has become, the dualistic way has become the water that we swim in. And I feel like it's really useful to recognize it rather than pretend or think we have moved on with it, because only when we see it can we actually begin to move forward. From this perspective, where the body is a thing we have, we cannot touch into the deeper wisdom of the body and the natural world. As long as we experience this as this thing that I walk around with, I cannot get a sense of the deeper wisdom. So, this is the collective development that I've sort of painted in a very, very broad sketch. And as I said earlier, from a developmentalist viewpoint, and I do consider myself a developmentalist, the notion is often that we individuals, we recapitulate the collective development. So I want to look at that, and I want to look at it in terms of what kind of development is it that we do go through. First of all, let me say, we all know when we come onto this planet, let's say through the first year of life, we go through a huge development. We, initially beings who are mostly in the horizontal relationship to gravity, have to be held and moved. We can't move through space on our own. We begin to, our movement capacities grow in, come online, and we slowly begin to be able to move through space, to come into sitting, to crawl, and to eventually come onto our 2 feet and stand in an upright position. That in itself is a huge development. We go through it more or less in the course of a year. The reason why I mention that is because, as you will see with the next theorists, they propose that our earliest sense of self is a sense of self that is very much based on our embodied and felt experience. So the way we traverse through these movement developments all contributes to our sense of self, to who we think we are. So I'm looking at 2 people, 2 neuropsychologists, one Antonio Damasio and one Daniel Stern, both very prolific in the field. And Damasio, he talks about something that he calls the proto-self, which is a collection of neural patterns that map the state and physical structure of the organism. So just think of yourself. Here you are, sitting in a chair. Whatever position you're in, something in you knows where you are, how you're sitting, and you know that that is you. So the sense of knowing you, yourself, is intimately connected to how you're constantly sensing your interior. And that's what Damasio calls the proto-self. Now, Daniel Stern similarly talks about an emerging sense of self, meaning there's some kind, it's not like there's the 2-month-old infant thinking, oh, here is me, Johnny, and I'm sitting or I'm lying down. No, we know there are no verbal capacities here, but there's some recognizing a sameness of experience, and this sameness is being taken as self. So he calls it an emerging sense of self. And this sense of self gets elaborated as we are more in our dyadic experience. So whether the dyad is mom or dad or whoever is the main caregiver or caregivers, that experience, this felt experience, how we're being held, how we're being handled, how we're being attuned to, contributes to another level of the self, of a sense of self, and this time in relationship or self as opposed to other. So there's a beginning distinction of distinguishing between this is me and this is not me. Yeah? Alan Shore similarly uses the dyadic exchange, you know, where mom is very attuned to her infant and joins in whatever state she is at. He calls that dyadic regulation, also contributing to our sense of self. Now, for those of you who have children or have little ones in your field, you know, as development continues, with, you know, we're moving into age 7 to 9 years old, there's a shift begins to happen. And Stern proposes it's a shift that begins to move towards a mental state. That means the child can actually somehow register that, and I'm just going to say mom, so excuse me dads, I don't want to exclude you, but just for simplicity reason. The child can actually get that she has a different state than mom does. There's a sense of different mindscapes, as he calls them, or mental states. So awareness shifts towards a slightly more abstract level, which gets even more elaborated as language comes in. And language is a great thing because it allows us to share with others what we experience. It allows us to represent our experience, but what does it also do? It's an abstraction. It takes us away from direct experience. And once language has come in, we begin to live in the world of representation more and more. Piaget, just another one who talks about that, the sensory motor being the basis for cognition. So what all of them have in common is the understanding that sensation is the foundation. It's a foundation for a sense of self. And we actually gradually leave it as we're moving into more verbal state. So I want to just recap this a little bit. So early development is based on development of movement and perceptual capacity. The structuralization of self is based on bodily experiences. And so is the meaning-making process. So here's what I'm saying, and I find it quite useful because what I'm wanting to say here is a certain degree of disembodiment is part of a normative developmental process. I think we all have gone through it, and I think it behooves us to recognize it rather than sort of bemoan the fact that we have lost these more direct states that are available to us earlier in childhood. I think there's a huge developmental step that we reach through that, but the thing is, we don't want to stop there. So here's where my title comes in, where I feel like at some point in our lives, we recognize, maybe just sort of in a diffuse way, or we recognize it very clearly that there is some yearning, there's some yearning for integration. There is some desiring to feel more connected to our bodies. We turn towards a deeper embodiment, sometimes out of a sense of fragmentation, pain, crises, health crises sometimes, or yearning for wholeness. So as I have outlined a little bit of a what I call an ascending process. I want to just look at, is there, what's the journey as we're beginning to drop deeper down into our bodies? Now, on one hand, we can say we're a little bit more in uncharted waters, because unlike developmentalists who have really charted early development, we don't have quite as much to fall back on. And I want to use my little Russian doll here. Are you familiar with these? So I got this in Moscow. Actually, Barbara and I were together at a conference. So the way I look at it, even though I call it a descending development, meaning a coming back down from a disembodied cognitive state, I think one can also see it as a moving inward, like looking at how there are these different experiences nested within each other. So here I'm taking, this is like our regular state. We're sort of, this is my body and me and my body, right? That's, honestly, that's the attitude that I walk around quite a bit. That's how I function in regular life. And yet there is a movement as I'm beginning to pay attention to my embodied experience. There's a movement deeper into my interior. And I call this state that I'm experiencing, I call it my personal body. It's like, I'm sure you all are familiar with it, as you do somatic explorations, as you do yoga, as you do martial arts, you sort of recognize your own tendencies, your somatic tendencies. You recognize how you have shaped yourself through the history of your life. And we all shape ourselves around our needs and around the demands and the interactions with others and the environment. So this is the personal body, and I want to add one particular piece here. Part of this, in my view, is also the pain body. That means we all know the place where we are encountering pain. Sometimes very pervasive, sometimes just moments of it. But how can we actually learn to be curious about pain and to just engage with it in a way that doesn't try to push it away, but is just exploring it as yet another embodied experience. It's a challenging place to be, and I know Eckhart Tolle talks a lot about the pain body, and you've probably read some of the stuff around it. I think it's a great way. He talks about the notion of recognizing when we're identifying with our pain or when we want to push away from it. So, but anyway, this is the personal body. Now, not to say that this is necessarily a sequential movement, but somewhere people experience what I call the fluid body. And those of you who have engaged in more subtle kind of practices, where your awareness is able to drop deeper into your senses, you experience at times the notion that all there is movement. Whether it's the continuous movement of the breath, or whether it's actually being aware of an ongoing flow and fluidity within our bodies. It's what Emily Conrad, who is the originator of the movement called, or the work called Continuum, she says about movement and about this state, she calls it, movement is something we are, not something we do. But we have to allow our awareness to drop to that level. Now, another layer that we come into contact with as we are deepening. See how I'm going deeper into the doll. So these are not surface experiences. Is when I encounter what I would describe a subtle body. And I want to just note, even the fact of naming it that is very tricky. Because as soon as we call it subtle body, we make it a thing, right? So I don't know how else to do it, but there are experiences where you are aware of maybe the softness and the opening in your heart center. There are experiences where you recognize maybe a certain clarity and luminosity in your head center. Or experiences where you recognize and are in touch with a power and a potency in your belly center. These are all more taking us into the subtlety of our embodiment. Yeah? And of course, whether we're talking about meridians or chakra system, these are all maps that are trying to tell us about that terrain. And it is a terrain that opens up. Again, not necessarily to be taken as this comes first and this comes first and then that. It's a fluid process. So, somewhere, well, let me back up. Remember how the distinction between subject and object established in the evolutionary trajectory through people like Plato. We recognize, we recapitulate that development as we're moving into the verbal phase, as we begin to represent our experience in words. We're distinguishing between self and other. We're distinguishing between self and body. We continuously make differentiations between subject and object. And yet, I feel like as we're going deeper into our body, that distinction has to soften and is softening. Otherwise, you can't go deeper. There is a So very slowly, there are moments where we begin to experience that body is not a thing we have, but an experience we are. That moment could arise out of yoga, where all of a sudden you're just so with the pose, you're sensing into it, you're sensing all the nuances, where the separating witness is disappearing and there is just the experience. Dogen, a Japanese Zen practitioner and philosopher, he calls this process the molting of the body-mind. But he spoke about it, he actually speaks about the fact that it is the body that needs to be in charge so that the mind can slowly melt into it. It cannot be the mind in charge of the body, it has to be the other way around. Now Osho, contemporary mystic, he talked about the moment where the dancer disappears into the dance. So these are all expressions that are pointing us towards an experience that is a very pivotal experience, because essentially we're beginning to undo that which has been building up a capacity to distinguish self and subject from object. Yeah? But this distinction begins to disappear and has to disappear if we want to continue to deepen into our body. So there is this continued descent that I would describe using Wilber's phrase. He talks about gross, subtle, and very subtle. I would describe it as the movement to the very subtle. And that is, in the literature, people are talking about it as the dark consciousness, which is at the innermost core of the body. In alchemy, we're talking about the primordial layer of the body. Kukai, and Yuasa, two Japanese philosophers, they talk about that at the depth of the body is a mysterious darkness. And Yuasa, he wrote the book called Body Towards an Eastern Body-Mind Theory. He distinguishes very clearly between what he calls right consciousness, which in our framework right now we would call a transcendent consciousness, and a dark consciousness, which we would call more of an immanent consciousness. So somehow we find in the literature that there is a sense of a dynamic stillness, a darkness, a place within the body where everything ceases. And I want to actually read you here. First I have to show you. So here is where the shape of the body disappears. And what is left over is just darkness. Darkness. So, a very powerful place. And let me read you. I have done a little bit of research with some of my students to just explore these different states. And here's a report from a student that I thought was quite descriptive of this. And after a somatic practice, she was writing in her journal the following words. There was a quietness that I had not experienced before, a stillness. I had a sense of containment, a darkness, a void. I fell completely into my body and had a sense of a complete and undefinable safety. I tried to be more aware of how I was feeling, how my body's mind felt, but my mind was experiencing, but all I could sense, feel, and be aware of was this darkness, so still, quiet, and serene. I'm filled with a sense of wonder, a sense of awe. This feeling has stayed with me since. What I had experienced was a gentle holding. A gentle holding was the experience of a true and pure love, a love whose very fragility is its strength. So this is just a report by somebody who seems like was able to drop into that state that in the literature is being described as this mysterious darkness. And it's also interesting how in our collective, oftentimes dark is being understood as bad or evil, but not in this notion or in this framework. So I wanted to say a couple more things. I know I've been talking for a while. What I feel like, first of all, this all to me points towards a developmental trajectory that begins with an ascending movement. We're moving away from direct experience. We're moving into representation. We're moving into abstraction. We're moving from multiplicity in the concrete to oneness and transcendence. And then somehow a turn needs to happen where we need to return to the individual, the unique, and the sensuousness of life, the depth of matter. And I've felt very thankful to Aurobindo because he has a wonderful concept of involution and evolution, which sort of explains the whole notion of spirit and matter. But as we're descending, and especially when we look at this notion of dark consciousness, we're actually transdescending from the particulars of our bodies, from the contours of our sensations, from the subtle senses all the way into a space where it's just substantial presence and holding. So we're transdescending through the particulars into the depth of bodily experience. What this means is, if we're opening up to that, it means we have to explore and value body as a form that has deep, deep value. And with it, the material realm has deep value. Aurobindo talked about that consciousness evolves out of undifferentiated primordial matter through the evolutionary process. So it's actually consciousness that makes itself known, that comes into manifestation through all the forms of life. And by us dropping into our bodies, we're beginning to participate. So I love this term where Aurobindo says, matter is the hiding place of spirit. So, let me see, let me say this here. As we're dropping into the depth of matter, consciousness is unleashed. The self joins with the processes of the body, and consciousness is unleashed. So the question is, well, this is all nice map, right? But what do we do with that? Or is there something to do about it? Or how can we support ourselves in cultivating contact to the immanent? And I know, I'm sure all of you have your own ways, but I want to just highlight the three, in my mind, really important elements. And that is, first of all, movement. Life is movement. We need to move in one form or another. It doesn't matter what kind, but somehow, in order to express our nature, we need to allow ourselves to move. Movement is intricately connected to sensation. Movement inspires sensation. And sensation is the felt experience of the body. We can only feel embodied if we're aware of our senses. So movement inspires sensation. And in order to recognize sensation, we have to bring awareness to us. So if sensation and movement are coupled with awareness, it delivers us deeply into our body. The process itself, it's a mystery, and all you can do is show up and participate. Now, one element, and I want to invite you to a very, very brief taste of it in just a moment. One element that I have found very, very useful is to actually begin to explore embryological patterns as these portals that allow us to contact ourselves more deeply. Obviously, we as organisms, we come into being through movements. It's the movement of the tissue, the meandering of certain tissues to become organs and structures, that over the course of embryogenesis, the first, I think, 3-4 weeks of our life where this is most what's happening, it's all movement that brings forth our shape. So by exploring and diving into those movements, I feel like we're actually sort of diving into our origin. It's a wonderful way of engaging with ourselves. Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen, who I think has just presented here a couple of days ago or a week ago or something, she also talks, she does a lot of exploration about embryological movements, and she talks about the fact that there are structures that come and go as we develop into a fully formed human organism. But each structure, whether it stays permanent or whether it is transitional, it leaves an energetic imprint. So somehow, even engaging with these transitional structures helps us to get in touch with the depths of our own origin. So anyway, early movements and states function as portals into our beginning. And here I'm going to leave you with this saying by Kabir, a mystic who said, "Be strong and enter into your own body, for there your foothold is firm. Consider it well, O my heart, go not elsewhere." So people like him have known of the significance of our embodiment and the significance for it in terms of our spiritual development. So what I would like to do, just to give us a little taste and just see how open you feel to it, but I want to just invite you to a very simple exercise. When we become, well, we all start out as this fertilized egg, and then the egg multiplies. And initially, the multiplication of the cells, all the cells are the same. They're what we call totipotent. All these cells have the capacity to become any cell. And then something happens, and I won't go into it, where the tissue or the cells begin to differentiate. And the first differentiation is a differentiation between two layers, a front layer and a back layer. The front layer, eventually it becomes what we call endodermal tissue, which is tissue out of which all the organ systems arise. And the back layer is what becomes ectodermal tissue, or it's the beginning of ectodermal tissue, the tissue of the nervous system and the skin. And then eventually a third tissue arises, the mesoderm, which arises in between those two layers, and that is the germ layer for muscles and bones and connective tissue. So anyway, you don't have to remember any of this, but I just want you to realize when we begin as one cell, and as we're multiplying, this is a multiplication into sameness. Each cell is the same. And then there is a differentiation between front and back. It's the first differentiation we have. So I would like to invite you to a very simple practice that brings home that kind of distinction. Yeah? And just see how now I invite you to close your eyes if that feels comfortable, because it allows you to bring more attention to your sensing. And then very gently introduce a very easy movement, and that is allow your upper body to just fold forward a tiny bit. Your head comes towards your chest. Do it slowly, and then after you've just come into a gentle forward flexion, reverse the movement, come into neutral, and then go backwards into a gentle backward flexion, where your head is gently moving backwards. Work within a range that's easy for you, and see if you can make it a continuous movement. Gently forward flexion. And reversing to come into a gentle backward flexion. As you're moving, as you continue the movement, when you're flexing forward, bring your awareness to the tissue in the front of your body, noticing how it gets condensed, how the cells are being condensed. And then as you come back into neutral and into a backward flexion, shift your awareness into the tissue in the back of your body, noticing condensing happening there as well. Backwards. Noticing the condensing in the back. Shifting your awareness from your back to the front and back. See if you notice what's the quality or the texture of your experience in the front? And what's the quality or texture of your experience in the back? Very slowly, whenever you feel ready, just hold yourself in neutral. Maintaining awareness of both the front back of your body. And then see what happens if you bring your awareness into the space in between. Simply paying realize that practice very quickly takes you into a very non-verbal state. So, and I just want to give the space in case there's anything you want to say or share or ask.
Yeah, I think it's curious that, like, I think it's interesting that the idea of spirituality is like you're your body and you're separate from your body, and that's the next step after thinking that there is no spirits. The next step is thinking that the spirit and the body, but there's no next step after that is paying attention to the body, which, like, I'm still on the second step. You know? And but it's like it has something that's occurred to me.
What does the second? So what's the first
The
step?
first step is like not having a sense of self-awareness,
Yes.
or like not having a sense of like there's a spirit and there's a
Right.
spiritual, just being machines. And I forget what the monk that we called it, but it was something like we have ideas. I guess if I was Plato, it's like this collective consciousness that was like the beginning of it, and like we do have ideas that like come into us, and it's like I don't know. I feel like it's interesting to think of like the body because it is more primitive, you know, and like it's more tangible.
Right.
And we think of that as like just counterintuitive, I guess.
Right.
But it's not. And I thought of it, and it's interesting.
And I think it's very interesting how counterintuitive it is to us, because that's our general setup. It's our mode of thinking. So, and this is not that you want to like sort of quote believe it, but you want to just sort of open just look at it and see what feels true here. You know, what rings true.
I think that is a good thing. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Doing that exercise was really different for me than doing any kind of body meditation, feeling the front and the back and going between them. I had this sense of feeling like a hollow chocolate Easter bunny, like this hard shell that I'd never felt this, like, it was weird. But it kind of, though, in that way, like, it by doing that made me feel distant from my body, like it was a machine or something I was inhabiting.
Well, that's the question. Are you distant from your body, or are you distant from a layer that you have identified with?
Mm-hmm.
Because who's to say that the space in between is not your body?
Yeah, and I was like, there's organs in there, there's things going on in there, but this outside just felt like a shell.
Right. And that's not unusual that we actually identify with the outside. And in certain spiritual traditions, like Barbara was saying in the Diamond Heart work, we talk about our identity is connected to a shell of the ego. And I do see the equivalent. There's a shell of the body that we identify with. So it's very interesting to sort of look, what do we take body to be? Is it just the solidity of bones and muscles? Where is body when we go into the subtlety?
The idea that you brought up around trans descent, and just the developmental dialectic, I guess you could call it. It seems, I mean, it's not surprising to me. It seems to happen over and over that certain Eastern situations or philosophers where it's say extremely elegantly. And so the yin yang symbol seems to just speak volumes to that idea. And then Alan Watts is a wonderful guy from Seattle who actually can speak these things pretty well. But just the idea that that yin and yang, they don't exist outside of a relationship. This is not, there's no, and so positing a permanence or an eternity,
Right.
and up and
Very
down.
good point.
He brings that out, that idea of, and that's when we come to the problem of languaging, which has to do with nouns versus verbs.
Yes.
So names
Yes.
versus understanding the process, so the process of feeling your body today, but feeling it tomorrow. And when you start writing that down, you'll probably see, wow, the language is so different the other day. And then you see it's a language of process and not a
language of things. Yeah. And it's a very good point that really, on one hand, the transcendent can only be there in relationship to the immanent. And yet, we're giving the transcendent more value. So all I can say is explore it. To me, this is the frontier. It's really, that's the place where it feels like, wow, by going deeply within, we're exploring the universe. So to me, it's really not so much about outer space. It's about inner space. What is it? And how do we participate with it? Because I do feel part of consciousness is about participating with what it is and being fully participating. So what that means, I think, we all have to find out for our own. But it feels like there's a call towards that. So unless there are any more questions, then I wanted to say thank you for spending your evening here and for being here.